Imagine being trained your entire life to believe that capture meant torture, that surrender equaled shame worse than death, that your enemy would strip away your humanity the moment you fell into their hands. Now imagine stepping off a train in frozen Wisconsin and being handed a hamburger, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and a wool blanket. For dozens of Japanese soldiers arriving at Camp McCoy in 1944, this wasn't just unexpected. It was reality-shattering. The metal doors of the freight cars screeched open, and bitter cold rushed in like a physical blow. Winter in Wisconsin felt nothing like the humid jungles of the Pacific, or even the cold nights in northern Japan. This was a different kind of cold, dry and cutting, biting through whatever remained of their tattered uniforms. The men who stepped down onto the platform moved slowly, not just from exhaustion, but from a kind of dazed uncertainty. Their boots, some barely held together with scraps of rope or wire, crunched against snow-packed earth. Many blinked repeatedly against the pale afternoon light, their eyes having grown accustomed to the dimness of the transport ship's hold and then the darkness of the train car. These were men who had seen combat, men who had fired rifles until their shoulders bruised, who had hidden in caves while bombs shook the earth above them, who had watched friends die in ways too horrible to speak of even years later. They had been taught from their very first day in the imperial military that capture represented the ultimate failure. Surrender wasn't just defeat, it was erasure. It meant you ceased to exist as a person of worth. The propaganda had been relentless and thorough. American soldiers, they were told, were savage beasts who would delight in torturing prisoners. They would starve them deliberately, humiliate them in ways designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. Death in battle was honorable. Capture was a stain that could never be washed away. So as these men descended from the train, many truly believed they were walking toward their execution. Perhaps not immediate, perhaps not today, but soon. They had prepared themselves mentally for brutality. Some had even whispered prayers for a quick death as the train rolled through the American countryside. They noticed farmland through the cracks in the car walls, vast stretches of it. More land than they had ever seen devoted to growing food. That alone had been unsettling. The propaganda had insisted America was weak, struggling, on the verge of starvation and collapse. Yet the fields looked healthy even in winter, and the small towns they passed through showed no signs of desperation. Now, standing in formation on the platform, they looked around carefully, trying not to appear too curious, trying to maintain whatever dignity remained to them. What they saw confused them immediately. Guard towers, yes. Rifles pointed in their direction, yes. Barbed wire coiling in loops around the perimeter, yes. All of this matched their expectations of a prison camp. But the atmosphere felt wrong. There was no chaos, no shouting guards striking prisoners for moving too slowly, no dogs straining at leashes, no bodies hanging as warnings. Instead, there was a kind of bureaucratic orderliness. Trucks moved along camp roads at regular intervals. Smoke rose from chimneys, not the thin smoke of meagre fires, but thick columns suggesting substantial heat sources. And the smell. Even from the platform, they could smell food cooking. Real food. Rich, fatty, substantial food that made their empty stomachs twist painfully. Several of the prisoners exchanged quick glances, communicating without words the shared confusion. One man's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the small cloth bundle containing everything he owned. Another kept his eyes fixed firmly on the ground, unwilling to look up, unwilling to hope that this might be anything other than the nightmare they'd been promised. A third man, older than most, with grey streaking his short-cropped hair, permitted himself a moment of observation. He studied the guards' faces. They looked alert but not cruel, professional but not sadistic. It was deeply confusing. The commands came in English, sharp and clear, the words meaning nothing to most of the prisoners. The tone, however, they understood. Military discipline has its own universal language. Line up, stand straight, move forward when told. Do not break formation. Through the few interpreters available, These instructions were relayed. The Japanese prisoners obeyed, because obedience was the only response they knew. But obedience here felt different. The guards weren't screaming. They weren't striking anyone who moved too slowly or didn't understand immediately. When one elderly prisoner stumbled slightly on the icy ground, a guard's hand moved toward his rifle, but only to shift it to a more comfortable position, not to use it as a club. Standing to one side, observing everything with clipboards and serious expressions, were men in different uniforms. Red Cross officials, though most prisoners didn't recognize the insignia. The presence of these observers, these neutral parties checking that procedures were followed correctly, seemed almost impossible. Back home, they had been told that America respected no laws, honored no treaties, that the Geneva Convention was a joke the Americans pretended to follow while doing whatever they wanted. Yet here were representatives from an international organization, watching, documenting, ensuring compliance. Could any of this be real? Or was it an elaborate performance, a facade that would drop away once the observers left? The intake process began with a mechanical efficiency that somehow still managed to feel more human than expected. The prisoners were herded, though that word suggests more force than was actually applied, into a processing building. Here, they were deloused. Their clothing, crawling with lice after weeks of transport, was taken away to be burned. Many of the men felt a sharp pang at this. These tattered, filthy uniforms were the last physical connection to their units, to their identity as soldiers. Watching them carried off felt like watching pieces of themselves disappear. But they were given clean clothing in exchange, plain and marked with large PW letters, but intact and warm. Medical examinations followed. American doctors and medics moved among them with stethoscopes and thermometers, checking for fever, examining wounds, noting signs of malnutrition that were obvious to any trained eye. One prisoner had a badly bandaged arm, the wound underneath festering and painful. He had expected this injury to be ignored, perhaps to be seen as deserved suffering for an enemy soldier. Instead, an American medic, a young man who looked barely 20 years old, carefully unwrapped the old bandage, cleaned the wound with a gentleness that seemed absurd, applied some kind of ointment and wrapped it again in clean white gauze. The prisoner sat completely still throughout this process, his mind unable to reconcile what was happening with everything he had been taught to expect. Throughout the processing building, similar scenes played out. Prisoners being weighed, revealing numbers far below healthy levels. Prisoners being given vitamin supplements, small chalky tablets they didn't understand. Prisoners being treated for minor ailments with a casual competence that suggested this was routine, not special treatment. Some of the men began whispering to each other, voices low and uncertain. "Why are they doing this?" one asked, his voice breaking slightly on the question. "We are their enemies. We killed their friends. Why would they fix my arm? Why would they give us medicine?" Another shook his head slowly, eyes darting toward the guards as if expecting punishment for speaking. "It must be a trick," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "They want something from us. Information, maybe. They will be kind until we trust them, and then they will spring the trap." But as the hours passed, no trap revealed itself. The processing continued with the same methodical care. Photographs were taken. Names were recorded. Each man was assigned a number. The bureaucracy of it all was somehow reassuring in its mundanity. This wasn't the chaos of war. This was administration, rules, procedures. The Geneva Convention, a phrase they had heard before but never believed would apply to them, was explained through interpreters. They had rights. They would be fed according to specific standards. They would be housed. They could write letters home, though these would be censored. They would work, but the work would not be designed to break them, and they would be paid small amounts. They would be inspected regularly by neutral parties to ensure these standards were maintained. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher before the war, listened to all of this with a growing sense of unreality. He turned to the man next to him and said quietly, "They speak of our rights. Rights for prisoners. Rights for enemies. This cannot be real. No nation treats its enemies this way. The other man, a farmer's son from a rural prefecture, responded with equal confusion. Perhaps they are very rich. Perhaps they can afford to be generous because they have so much. But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. Generosity to enemies? While a war still raged? It made no sense according to anything they had been taught about how the world worked. After the medical checks came the assignment to barracks. The prisoners were marched across the compound, and the sound of their boots against the packed snow created a rhythm that reminded several of them painfully of drills back home. The comparison made their current status even harder to accept. Once they had marched as soldiers of the Empire. Now they marched as prisoners, defeated, captured, alive when they should have died with honor. The cold bit through even their new clothing, and several men shivered uncontrollably. But when they reached their assigned barracks and stepped inside, they found wood-burning stoves already lit, radiating heat throughout the space. Rows of bunks lined the walls, and folded on each bunk was a genuine wool blanket. Several prisoners moved slowly to their assigned beds and sat down heavily, as though their legs could no longer support them. The mattresses were thin, nothing luxurious, but they were softer than the ground, softer than the bare wood or metal they had slept on during transport. One man reached out and touched the blanket with trembling fingers, feeling the wool's texture, its weight, its promise of warmth. He lifted it and pressed it against his face, and his shoulders began to shake with silent sobs he tried desperately to hide from the others. Outside the windows, they could see the barbed wire. No matter how warm the barracks, no matter how unexpected the blankets, that wire was always visible, a reminder in case they forgot for even a moment. They were prisoners. This was captivity. The guards in the towers held rifles. The gates were locked. Their freedom, their lives as they had known them, were gone. Yet even with all of this, the contrast between expectation and reality gnawed at them in ways they couldn't express. As evening approached on that first day, the men sat on their bunks or stood in small groups, speaking in low voices. The conversations circled around the same questions again and again. Can we believe this? Is this real? What are they planning? Some insisted that the true horror would come soon, that this initial treatment was designed to lower their guard. Others weren't sure what to believe. The evidence before their eyes contradicted years of indoctrination, but accepting that evidence meant admitting they had been lied to about fundamental things. That path led to dangerous questions about what else might have been lies. A young soldier, barely 18 when he had been conscripted, sat on his bunk with his knees drawn up to his chest. He had been terrified since the moment of his capture, certain that every hour might be his last. Now, in the warmth of the barracks, wearing clean clothing and having been treated by a doctor, he felt a different kind of fear. The fear that maybe, just maybe, his own nation had sent him to die based on lies. The fear that the enemy might not be the monster he had been taught to hate. That fear, in its way, was more destabilizing than the fear of death had been. Night fell over Camp McCoy, and with it came a darkness that felt absolute to men used to tropical latitudes. The winter night in Wisconsin seemed to press down from above, thick and cold. Inside the barracks, a few men tried to sleep, exhausted beyond measure. Others lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into its evening routine. Guard changes, distant voices, the creak of wood in the cold, and underneath everything, a question they couldn't escape. What happens next? The answer began the next morning, when the bugle call sounded across the camp just as dawn broke grey and cold over the horizon. The sound pierced through the barracks, jolting men awake. For several prisoners, the confusion was immediate. They had heard that sound before, that particular military wake-up call. They had heard it in their own camps, in their own training. For a disorienting moment, some of them forgot where they were, forgot that they were prisoners, forgot everything except the deeply ingrained response to wake and prepare for the day. Then reality reasserted itself. The voices outside spoke English. The uniforms visible through the windows were American. This was Wisconsin, not Japan. They were captives, not soldiers. The guards called roll, shouting names and numbers that the prisoners were still learning to recognize as their own. They were ordered into formation outside, where the cold immediately cut through everything. Morning formation was brief, but even that surprised the prisoners. It was organized, yes, but not needlessly harsh. No one was struck for being slow. No one was punished for shivering in the cold. After roll call, they were directed toward a large building they had not yet entered, the mess hall. As they approached, that smell they had noticed yesterday grew stronger. Cooking food. Real, substantial cooking food. The smell of meat, of frying oil, of bread. For men who had lived on increasingly meager rations for months or even years, who had watched their food supplies dwindle to nearly nothing as Japan's supply lines collapsed, the smell was almost physically painful. Their stomachs cramped. Mouths watered involuntarily. Several prisoners pressed their hands against their midsections, trying to quiet the audible growling. But first, before food, there were more procedures. They were gathered in a large room adjacent to the dining area. A Red Cross representative stood at the front, an interpreter beside him. The representative began to speak, and the interpreter translated his words into Japanese. The speech was detailed and careful. He explained their rights under international law. He explained that they would be fed adequately, that the food would meet certain minimum standards of nutrition and quantity. He explained that they would be housed in conditions that met specific requirements. He explained that they would be allowed to send letters home at regular intervals. He explained that they would be required to work, but that this work would be compensated and would not be designed to endanger them. He explained that representatives like himself would visit regularly to ensure all of these standards were being maintained. The prisoners listened in near silence. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others stared straight ahead with carefully blank expressions. The words being spoken seemed to describe some alternate reality, not the war they knew. One prisoner, standing near the back, leaned close to his neighbor and whispered, "Rights. He speaks of our rights as if we are people deserving of consideration. Are we not defeated? Are we not worthless?" His neighbor whispered back, "Perhaps they follow these rules because the world watches. Perhaps if the world did not watch, they would show their true nature." But the representative continued, and the interpreter's voice remained steady and clear. "These are not special provisions we are making for you," he explained. "These are requirements of international law that we are bound to follow. You are protected by treaty. We will uphold that treaty. If you have complaints about your treatment, there are procedures for registering those complaints. Your well-being is not a gift we choose to give or withhold. It is a legal obligation." After the explanation came more medical attention. Doctors moved through the room, conducting follow-up examinations on the men who had shown the most serious signs of malnutrition or illness the day before. They checked temperatures again. They looked into eyes and mouths. They pressed fingers against lymph nodes and listened to breathing. When one doctor discovered that a prisoner had a persistent cough, he immediately arranged for that man to be isolated temporarily, concerned about tuberculosis. The prisoner, separated from his fellows, felt a moment of panic. Was this the beginning of the true treatment? Was he being taken away for interrogation or worse? But he was simply moved to a small medical ward, given medicine, and monitored carefully. Within days, when the cough proved to be nothing serious, he was returned to the general population. The medical attention extended to things the prisoners had never considered important enough for military concern. Dental checks, vision tests, examination of old injuries that had healed poorly. One prisoner had broken his hand badly months ago, and it had set incorrectly, leaving his fingers twisted and barely functional. An American doctor examined it, shook his head, and explained through an interpreter that while he couldn't re-break and reset it now, he could provide exercises that might restore some mobility. The prisoner stared at the doctor in complete bewilderment. Why would the enemy care about his hand? He couldn't fight any more anyway. The injury made him worthless as a soldier. Yet here was this American doctor spending time trying to help him regain use of his fingers. By afternoon, the prisoners had been issued their final pieces of equipment: work gloves, better boots for those whose footwear was completely destroyed, writing paper and pencils for the letters they would be allowed to send. Small items, but each one chipped away at their expectations. They were being equipped for survival, for a continuation of existence, not for suffering and death. That evening came the moment that would lodge itself in the memory of every man present. The moment that would become the story they told and retold, though often with confusion rather than clarity, for the rest of their lives. They were directed to line up outside the mess hall. The line moved slowly, men shuffling forward with their metal trays held in both hands. The smell from inside was overwhelming now. Rich and fatty and complex in a way that their memories of food had forgotten was possible. The door to the serving area stood open, and as each man approached, he could see inside. American cooks stood behind long counters, working efficiently. Steam rose from multiple pots and pans. The heat from the cooking area radiated outward, and the food being served wasn't scraps. It wasn't the dregs of better meals saved for Americans. It was real food, full portions. The same food, the prisoners would later realize, that the American soldiers themselves were eating. The first prisoner in line stepped forward hesitantly. The cook, a stocky man with rolled-up sleeves and a stained apron, didn't look at the prisoner with hatred or disgust. He didn't look at him with much of anything beyond a kind of tired focus that suggested he'd been doing this job for hours and had more hours ahead. He picked up a large meat patty from a griddle where dozens more sizzled, placed it on a soft white bun, and set it on the prisoner's tray. Then he added a scoop of fried potatoes, golden and glistening with oil. Finally, he reached into an ice-filled container and pulled out a glass bottle, moisture beading on its surface. He popped the cap with a practiced motion and set the bottle next to the food. The red script on the label meant nothing to the prisoner. He stared at the tray as though it contained something impossible. "Move along," the cook said flatly, already reaching for the next burger. The prisoner shuffled forward, and the man behind him stepped up. The same process repeated, and again, and again. As the line progressed, prisoners began to realize this wasn't a special meal. This was just dinner. This was what the Americans ate. This level of abundance, this amount of meat and fat and sweetness, was normal to them. When the prisoners carried their trays to the long wooden tables that filled the dining area, many of them sat down without beginning to eat immediately. They looked at the food. They looked at each other. Some seemed to be waiting for permission. Others seemed to be waiting for a trap to spring. A few appeared to be simply trying to process what they were seeing on the tray in front of them. One prisoner, his hands shaking slightly, picked up the bottle. He had never seen anything like it. The glass was cold against his palms. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, and bubbles rose through it continuously. He brought it carefully to his lips and tilted it back. The taste that hit his tongue was shocking. Sweetness, intense and immediate, unlike anything he'd tasted in years. Then came the carbonation, the sharp, fizzing burn against his throat and the roof of his mouth. He gasped, nearly choking, and had to lower the bottle quickly. His eyes watered. The sweetness lingered on his tongue, and despite the choking, despite the strangeness, he found himself wanting more. After a moment, he took another careful sip. This time he was ready for the burn. The sweetness flooded his senses again, and underneath it was a complexity of flavour he had no words for. At the next table, another prisoner lifted the hamburger with both hands. The bun compressed slightly under his grip, soft and yielding. He could feel the warmth of the meat through the bread. Grease had soaked into the bottom bun. He stared at it for a long moment, then brought it to his mouth and bit down. Juice ran over his lips and down his chin. The the taste of beef, real beef, not the tiny portions of fish or the occasional bit of pork they used to get, but rich, fatty, substantial beef, overwhelmed everything else. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing, and tears began to slip down his face. He couldn't stop them. The embarrassment of crying in front of others fought with the overwhelming relief of taste, of fat, of food that didn't leave him hungry after eating it. When he swallowed, he had to pause before taking another bite, his throat tight with emotion. All around the mess hall, similar reactions played out. Some men ate quickly, almost frantically, as though afraid the food would be taken away. Others ate with deliberate slowness, trying to make it last. A few couldn't eat at all at first, too shocked by the meal to function properly. Several prisoners wept openly, though they tried to hide it by lowering their faces or turning away. One man laughed, a strange, broken sound that he couldn't control. Another sat completely still with tears streaming down his face, the hamburger held in his hands, unable to bring himself to take even the first bite. The fried potatoes, crisp on the outside and soft inside, were sprinkled with salt. Real salt, not the carefully rationed pinches they had grown accustomed to. The potatoes tasted of fat and salt and earth in a way that reminded several men painfully of home, of better times, of meals with family before the war consumed everything. One prisoner ate his fries one at a time, placing each one in his mouth and letting it sit there for a moment before chewing, trying to memorize the taste. Conversations began quietly at the tables. Whispers at first, then slightly louder discussions. The shock was universal, but the interpretations varied wildly. At one table, a group of prisoners debated in hushed tones. "They want to soften us," one argued, his voice harsh despite being low. "They feed us like this to make us forget who we are, to make us weak and compliant. This is a weapon, just a different kind than bullets." Another prisoner shook his head. "Or perhaps they simply have so much that they can afford to feed even their enemies. Perhaps we have been lied to about American weakness. Look at this food. This is not the meal of a nation on the edge of collapse." A third man, older and quieter than the others, spoke carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "that perhaps they truly believe in their rules. These Geneva Convention laws. Perhaps they follow them not because they are weak, but because they think it proves they are civilized. They feed us well to prove to themselves that they are not monsters." "That is insane," the first prisoner snapped back. "Why would they care what they think of themselves? We are at war. You do not worry about being civilized during war." "Yet they do," the older man replied simply, gesturing at the meal before them. "The evidence is here on this tray." At another table, the conversation took a different turn. A young prisoner, barely into his 20s, spoke with his voice breaking. "My family in Hiroshima," he said quietly. "They are eating weeds. They are eating bark from trees. My mother wrote that they boil water with a few grains of rice just to have something to put in their stomachs. And here I sit, eating meat, eating potatoes fried in oil, drinking this sweet water. What does that make me?" No one at his table had an answer. The guilt sat among them like a physical presence. They were alive. They were warm. They were eating food their families could not imagine. And all of this because they had been captured, because they had failed to die with honor. The contradiction was almost unbearable. One prisoner reached for the Coca-Cola bottle again, this time tipping it back and drinking deeply despite the burn. When he lowered it, he said to no one in particular, "I thought I knew what sweetness tasted like." But I had forgotten. In our country now, there is no sugar for anything but medicine. And here they give it to us in bottles, in quantities we could never imagine. His voice was filled with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite wonder. It was closer to despair. The mess hall guards watched all of this without comment. To them, it was just another meal service, another duty shift. They saw prisoners eating, some crying, some laughing, some sitting in stunned silence. But they didn't understand the depth of what was happening. They couldn't know that each bite of that hamburger, each sip of that Coca-Cola, was destroying and rebuilding something fundamental in the minds of the men they guarded. These weren't just meals. They were evidence that everything the prisoners had been taught about their enemy was wrong, and if that was wrong, what else might be? As the meal ended and trays were collected, the prisoners filed out of the mess hall slowly. Many walked with a different posture than when they had entered, though it would be hard to say exactly what had changed. Perhaps it was the weight in their stomachs, the strange feeling of being genuinely full for the first time in months. Perhaps it was something else, something harder to define. The evening air felt even colder after the warmth of the mess hall, and the prisoners hurried back to their barracks. That night, as they lay in their bunks under wool blankets, the conversations continued in whispers that stretched late into the darkness. Some prisoners insisted again that this was all a trick, but their arguments carried less conviction now. Others admitted openly that they no longer knew what to believe. The taste of that meal lingered on their tongues and in their memories. The sweetness of the Coca-Cola, the richness of the beef, the salt and fat of the fried potatoes. These sensations were real in a way that propaganda had never been real. One prisoner, lying on his back and staring at the ceiling, spoke into the darkness. If this is what they feed their enemies, what do they feed their own people? What kind of nation can afford to be this generous to prisoners while fighting a war on two fronts? Another voice answered from across the room. A strong nation. A rich nation. A nation we were told was on the verge of defeat. Everything we were told was a lie. Not everything, a third voice objected. They are still our enemies. Their bombs still fall on our cities. Their submarines still sink our ships. Do not forget that. I am not forgetting, the second voice replied. But I am wondering if we ever truly understood what we were fighting. If we ever truly understood what kind of enemy this was. Silence fell after that.